Welcome to the book, where two guys tell you about the books they're reading. I'm Livius Nedden.
And I'm Rob Olson. The book that we are talking about this episode is Inspection by Josh Malerman, a book that we have been looking forward to. I don't know, it's probably about a year since like the cover first showed up, right, on the social medias and stuff.
Yeah, at least it feels that way if it's not. But it's interesting because, you know, the big publishers, it always takes them like a year or 18 months, right? But in this one, they suddenly just magically moved up the release date by like 5 or 6 weeks, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
I wonder why that is. Maybe we'll dig into that a little bit.
For anybody who has not been listening, I'll read Josh's bio, but I want to say first that I believe that every mainstream release of his we have covered and done a review of. There have been some like limited release books like Goblin and stuff we haven't read, but Bird Box, Black Mad Wheel, Unburied Carol, Inspection, A House at the Bottom of a Lake. That's everything, right? Mainstream?
Yes, I believe so.
Cool. So here's the bio. Anyway, I'm just kind of rambling at this point. Josh Malerman is the New York Times bestselling author and one of two singer-songwriters for the rock band The High Strung. His debut novel, Bird Box, is the inspiration for the hit Netflix film of the same name. His other novels include Unburied Carol and Inspection. Malerman lives in Michigan with his fiancée, the artist and musician Allison Lako? Lako? In my head, it's always been
probably.
Lako.
Yeah.
I feel so bad because she probably knows how to pronounce Olson, and I'm just screwing up her last name.
Yeah, but she probably doesn't know how to pronounce my name. So
all right, well,
there's that.
there we go. So I feel better.
Yeah. Hey, something occurred to me when we were reading this bio. Do you think that maybe this book got moved up because of the ridiculous success of the Bird Box movie?
Yeah, that could have something to do with it. Like, it got moved up because the uncorrected proof that I have in my hands says on sale April 23rd, 2019. And the actual published date is 2 days from when we're recording this, which will be March 19th.
Correct. For anybody that doesn't get what I was talking about there, so Josh wrote Bird Box a few years ago. Phenomenal book. It got made into a Netflix movie, which then catapulted Bird Box, 3 or 4 years after its release, onto the New York Times bestseller list, thereby making Josh a New York Times bestseller. So my thought is Bird Box is a big hit. And they go, well, that's cool because we've got his next book. It's coming out in April. And then someone goes, hey, would you say the guy's name was Malerman? I'm pretty sure he's on the New York Times bestseller list this week. And they go, oh, shit, let's get his book out sooner. And suddenly the mad black wheel of publishing moved faster and got his book out 5 weeks earlier. So we're very excited. We've been sitting on this thing since January, I think, is when we got these. And it's time. It's now time for us to talk about Inspection. Here's a synopsis. Jay is a student at a school deep in a forest far away from the rest of the world. Jay is one of only 26 students, all of whom think of the school's enigmatic founder as their father. Jay's peers are the only family he has ever had. The students are being trained to be prodigies of art, science, and athletics, and their life at the school is all they know, and all they are allowed to know. But Jay suspects that there is something out there beyond the pines that the founder does not want him to see, and he's beginning to ask questions. What is the real purpose of this place? Why can the students never leave? And what secrets is their father hiding from them? Meanwhile, on the other side of the forest, in a school very much like Jay's, a girl named Kay is asking the same questions. Jay has never seen a girl, and Kay has never seen a boy. As Kay and Jay work to investigate the secrets of their two strange schools, they come to discover something even more mysterious. Each other.
Hell yeah. That's all I got.
All right, keep reading. Yeah, I want to start by saying that I did not, if I read the synopsis, it was so long ago that I forgot about that last paragraph. The one about Kay. So even in my head, up until a half hour ago when I pulled the synopsis, I was like, man, we have to stop about halfway into the book. We have to be very careful. The water we tread for this. So yeah, here's the rundown. Here's me restating the synopsis. In the middle of the forest, there is a school. There are 26, or at one point there were 26 boys in it, and they are named A through Z, which is pretty convenient if there are 26 of them. And they are raised without the knowledge of the opposite sex. And when I say that, that doesn't mean they've never seen a woman or never talked to a woman. Their lives are such that women have been completely erased. So books they read have no women in it. Stories they're told by the people, the staff at the school, contain nothing about women. They read fiction books that are written specifically for them with settings that they're familiar with. So it seems like all the books take place around the school that they live at. So they have no idea that there is women out there at all. As a matter of fact, it starts off with them talking about how they all came from the living trees. They all grew on a tree, and that's where they came from.
Yeah, and I was thinking about this because if you just think about it at surface level, it's like, oh, they grew up without girls. But it's so much deeper than that. Like, their entire world was, like, crafted to be absent that. And that's, like, way more fucked up, I think, if to think about, like you were explaining. So right off the bat, the tone of the book for me was kind of like there is an insidiousness to what's going on, because in order to reach kind of the goals that the school has, they're like overtly and massively lying to these like innocent children, and it just makes it so evil in a not violent way. But like, because it's real and because it has like a lasting impact on the children, I feel like it's much darker in a way. I don't know how you feel about that.
It's tough because, and I mean, as we get talking more of the story, I think this will be a little bit less linear of a review than maybe we normally do. The goal, as stated in the synopsis, which is probably inaccurate, and I'll explain why in a second, is that if they have the distraction of women removed from their lives, they can focus on their studies and excel at whatever it is that they're working on. Now, the reason I say the synopsis is a little off, the athletics part, like you could never let one of these boys be an athlete because that would mean eventually they'd get out into the real world. And the plan is for that to never, ever happen. I mean, the long-term plan, right, even if it's not stated succinctly in the book, is that they will live their entire lives in this area, excelling at science, art, or whatever, but that the world will never, or that they will never be out in the world doing this. I mean, do you get that feeling too?
That's tricky because, like, and maybe we're getting a little ahead of, like, we might want to explain more of the story first, but, like, one of the, so basically, I'm going to break down the story a little bit, and then I'll get to my point. The story starts out very much from the perspective of the boys, but not just the boys. There are parts early on and throughout the book where we see things from the perspective of the dude that's running the show and other non-boys as well. And so we're given context of what the goal is from the perspective of the non-boys. And I'm just pretty sure that very early on, like, there were some red flags about the process or the system that they have in place too, based on who they chose to hire and things like that. But I feel like part of the contracts that the people signed when they signed up to be, I guess, staff for this, let's call it an experiment, was there was like a time limit of something like 20 years. Does that sound right?
Yes.
So for me, it was unclear whether that meant that at the age where these children are now fully adults, like probably graduates of college, like the equivalent of graduates of college, like I didn't know if that meant that they were going to be introduced to the world, like, hey, look what we did, or like their discoveries would be kind of siphoned back into the world, because like if they never went back into the world somehow, how would anybody ever know that the experiment was a success?
That is a good point, and one I want to follow up on offline. So in spoiler talk, we'll talk about that a little bit, because my thoughts get to be a little spoilery on this.
Spoiler,
Yeah. So, as Rob said, we pick up kind of learning about this school, this place. I don't even know what to call it. Through the eyes of boys, but boys who are 12 years old. So that's where we start following the story, and then of course we have, I don't want to say flashbacks, but callbacks to previous times on things when they were younger that occurred, and memories they have of other boys who may or may not still be around, and that kind of thing. So 12-year-olds, but advanced 12-year-olds, because their whole life has been squeezed into a very structured education and like a goal driven ideology. So it's not that they don't have free time, and they have friends, and they're not actually followed by cameras or anything like that. So they're given the freedom to be kids within the confines of this program. So they have friends, they have inside jokes, they have kids they like better than other kids and stuff. So for all intents and purposes, they grow up fairly normally. If you were to send your kid maybe to a boarding school or something where they never got to come home, with the exception of the lack of the opposite sex.
Yeah, and the control that is exerted is very interesting. So at the very beginning of the book starts out by saying like no boy has ever failed an inspection, and so this is where the book's title comes into play. An inspection, I think it's every morning. The kids have to, when they wake up, they get called in for an inspection. They all line up in a hallway. They get called in one at a time. They strip completely naked and are basically examined by inspectors to see if they've contracted any diseases or unclean, basically, is what it is. And so, like, part of the control that's exerted on the kids is you act a specific way, and you have to do these certain things in order to not become unclean. And there's these diseases like rots, I think, is one, and V's.
Mm-hmm.
What's the other one? The lacospores or something like that. It's something weird. But anyway.
Something sores. Yeah.
Sores. Yeah. Anyway, and so the inspection basically is one of their ways of keeping the kids' behavior in check, because they frame what's good behavior and bad behavior around, we'll find out in an inspection, like if you've been doing this thing you shouldn't.
Yeah, for the most part, it's worked for a long time. We should probably mention this is the first time this experiment's been tried, too. So as we follow, and I know we haven't mentioned any of the other characters yet, but as we follow we'll call them staff of the school, they're learning as they go. So the structure is, there is a man named Richard, who the children know as D.A.D., which I often wondered if they actually just called him D.A.D., like their names, their letters
Right.
or names, or if they actually call him Dad. It's always done as D.A.D. He's learning as he goes. So he's the basically the man with the idea, and he's hired on people, and they have psychiatrists on staff. And then, as Rob had mentioned, they have a bunch of people who are contracted out to work there, and signing what are those called?
Like
The
non-disclosure
non-disclosure
agreements?
agreements. Yeah, exactly. But really, I don't even know how much those are needed. I think that all the people involved kind of know that there's something a little wrong with what they're doing, and saying something to anybody, not only would they lose the very high pay that they have to do these jobs, but would be implicated, right? Like, how long do you have to be there before you're not implicated as someone who's decided to run a long-term psychological experiment on children? I'm guessing not very long. So if you're in for, you're in for a little bit, you're in for the long haul.
Yep. And so kind of the tipping point for the story in the beginning is the idea that now that all the boys are turning 12, they're going to start to go through puberty, and they're going to start to, like, their bodies are changing, their hormones are changing, their attitudes and their personalities are changing. And the concern is, since this has never been, tried before, as this change is happening, will they be more likely to challenge authority, do things they're not supposed to, do things that could jeopardize the overall experiment? And also, the idea is kind of introduced that, like, what is the staff going to act like, having gone through this kind of long-term deception for so long, at some point, are they going to also start cracking, under the pressure?
They have a term for it. It's called the guilts.
The guilts.
And it comes up occasionally in the book that someone might have the guilts and that they need to work through their shit and get back on track, essentially.
Yep.
And then, because it's in the synopsis, I guess we have to talk about it, right? So there's another one of these places, not very far away, and you'll never guess what's there. There's an MOM with 26 girls whose names are A through Z, that have grown up without any idea what a man is.
Yep. That's that. So, I knew going into this that we were going to have a lot we couldn't spoiler, and there's absolutely going to be a spoiler talk for this. But that's your premise, dudes. Like, basically, they created this reality in the real world. Like, this takes place in 2018, 2019, so in the present day. Hidden away from the world is this place where kids think they grow on trees because there's no other sex to reproduce, and that their entire world is this one building that they live in the courtyard and the forest that surrounds it. That's all they know about. And the idea is, outside of these distractions, absence the distractions of girls, they're going to be geniuses because they're just focusing on their academic pursuits. And it's kind of wacky.
It's a little out there. And I want to note, kind of as a general, because we talked about all the books that we've read from Josh, and Bird Box, definitely a supernatural element. The House at the Bottom of the Lake, definitely a supernatural element. Mad Black Wheel, definitely a supernatural element. Unbury Carol, a slight supernatural element, right? Like, we even argued a little bit, not argued, about, ghouls and whatever, but really, there's a woman that can has a disease that makes her look like she's dead, and it lasts for days and days. So a little bit of supernatural element. This one, I really thought from the synopsis and stuff, I was like, oh, this is going to be like science fiction-y, right? Like, this is on another planet where they've separated men from women. It's a colony on Mars or whatever. And it's not. As Rob mentioned, it takes place very much today, very much in, I don't think it's spoiling anything, in Michigan. So it takes place. It takes place in the real world, quote unquote, which is interesting because he went away from supernatural, and this is the first thing that I've read from him long form that didn't contain some element of the supernatural. So it's an interesting transition, because this kind of dystopian separation of the sexes and stuff reminds me a little bit like Ayn Rand's Anthem and stuff, but that had a very kind of science fiction-y feel to it. Mm-hmm. This one is even more disturbing when you really realize that it's taking place today in our world, and you realize that it's possible.
Yeah, 100% possible. Insane, but perfectly possible. And I have some thoughts about that I wonder if we'll get into here or in spoiler talk. I think I could talk about them here, but maybe we'll do a little offline chat to figure out where the best place is for that. But yeah, absolutely 100% grounded in reality. So one thing I want to point out, because we didn't talk much about characters except for like the staff side of things, on the kids side of things, it's interesting because we're seeing kids that have grown up for 12 years, kind of in a bubble, and very much nurtured to grow academically. And you see that kids have taken on their own personalities and talents and stuff like that within that realm. So that's kind of a neat thing. And they explore it as the book goes on, what the unique characteristics of the boys are, and how that kind of what that says about the experiment stuff. For example, I think it's Q on the boys' side has kind of a spiritual approach to things, which is funny because the kids are all raised absent any religion or the idea of religion at all. So the fact that this boy is kind of filtering the world through, like, I don't want to say ideology, but I think in the book they said like he was inventing God, and I think there's even a quote that said something like, "In the absence of God, one must invent him," or something like that. But anyway, that's like a yeah. So he's doing that. He's this particular boy. The way he is reacting to the world is spirituality is what makes the world make sense to him. And so that's one of the unique, but not unique, but interesting things about the way the story is told is that as we explore the interactions with the different boys and stuff, we see how their personalities are growing things that we experience in the real world, but in their little bubble.
And what a bubble it is. We touched on it a little earlier, but I mean, they have everything finely crafted for them. So, you know, I thought about this a lot during it because we're introduced to this idea through a character named Lawrence Luxley, who is he's an author. He's the only author they know. So he has penned something like 30 books, and they are, I mentioned it earlier, they all take place in or around their school. And they felt like a lot of them were kind of like bubblegum Hardy Boys, kind of, you know, how we solve this problem. And of course, it's just boys and men in the stories, but that's the only literature they have exposure to. I thought, like, in textbooks, I mean, I guess depending on the textbooks, I mean, like a science textbook, if you're not actually naming scientists, probably, you know, just has to be, you know, biology would be the only one that maybe they're not introduced to, or that would it really have to be cut down. Like your average math book probably doesn't address things like men and women unless it's
right.
Well, but you know what I mean? Like, in, you know, history, they probably don't get any type of history book because they really don't know there's an outside world.
Right.
That's all kind of kept from them. Their entire world is what they see and hear every day, and they have no anything. They'll watch like a movie, but the movie is custom made for them, and they get movie night like once a year or whatever. Like, it's not a frequent thing. So there's no Netflix, there's no Hulu. Everything is cultivated 100% for them. So I mean, when you say in a bubble, that's like the strongest bubble you could ever have, right? Like, it's not shielding you from the outside world, it's creating a world for you to live in. But Luxley is an interesting character because he was an unpublished writer who, you know, was approached to do this gig, and he's done it. And, you know, he kind of, we see through his eyes the going back and forth about how successful he is, even though nobody outside these, you know, the walls of this school know who he is. But he frequently reflects back on his time as a struggling author and his little, you know, author club that he hangs out with at the bar. And he's a little bit of a douchebag, but he's the person through whose eyes we start to see guilt. So he's an interesting character, and I thought he was worth mentioning.
Yeah, definitely. And that's the thing. As the book carries on, probably to the point where we're teetering on spoilers, like, the points where you see the staff, the grown-ups, kind of start going like, I don't know, are really strong points in the book, because everybody kind of figures it, like, everybody kind of knows, like, this is kind of a fucked up thing we're doing. And it's just a matter of, like, the way that they're structured to be there is they're getting paid out after fulfilling a contract of a certain amount of time. If they go before then, you know, there's a thing called the corner, which we didn't mention. But the corner is not a good place, and they're worried about going to the corner if they do something wrong, if they step out of line. Yeah,
the corner. Which is funny because that's, you know, how much of this, like Richard being DAD, right? And the corner, and yep. Even the fake diseases that they could get, you could almost picture, you know, yourself telling a 5-year-old, like, oh, you don't want to touch that, you'll get cooties,
right,
to keep them from doing something. So it's funny how much of this correlates back to how you would maybe discipline a child. You know what I mean? So you use these fake threats of cooties or V's in this case, you know, but how, if that's all that they know and they have no exposure to knowing cooties isn't a real thing, how they're 12 years old and still worried about the rots.
Yep.
You know what I mean? So it's yeah.
And the cool thing about the corner specifically is, like, they are raised to think that the corner is like the worst possible, consequence of doing something. And that's all they know is like, you never want to go to the corner. But then when we see things from the adult's point of view, they're also afraid of the corner. And that makes it so much more powerful because like this one, like, while the other stuff is so obviously just, cooties, the corner is even more sinister because like the adults are in on the fear of it as well.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Like, how much of this happens in real life? So I was telling someone about this book, and I was doing it this afternoon. Someone had asked me, "Hey, you reading anything good?" And I said, "Well, this is what I'm reading." And I told him what it was about. And he goes, "Oh, that reminds me of something I read." I don't have details, but he was talking about a nutcase father whose mother was also a nutcase and was like a fortune teller of some sort, and had told him he was going to have 3 girls. And they were all going to be like prodigious rock stars. And that when he had 3 girls, he essentially would force them to play and create music, right, but without ever having heard music before. So he was teaching them instruments without so from when the time you're 2-3 years old, right? You're hearing music in the car with mom and dad or whatever, or you're singing songs at school. They had never heard music, but were being forced to create music. So things like this happen, and I think about things like, military boarding schools that probably operate very similarly to this school, with the exception of you have knowledge of the outside world, obviously, and you have knowledge of the opposite sex, but focusing a child's mind in the direction that you really want it to go, I guess can pay off in the real world. Now, is it ever done to this extreme? I don't know. Not that anybody's been caught doing it, but I also think back to Mike Tyson. I listened to an interview with Mike Tyson a few months ago, and I didn't realize from the time he was 12, he was essentially turned over to this guy who was his boxing coach.
Yeah.
And all he lived and breathed was boxing. And not just boxing, but that in order to be successful, you had to destroy your opponent. And that's what was, hammered into his head from the time he was, I don't remember, it was like 11 or 12, to the time when he was like the world champion at like 19. And like literally the scariest man alive. Mm-hmm. So, there's some truth in what Malerman writes here about focusing somebody. And I think we already do it to a certain extent.
Yeah, not to the extreme that this book does, but like, right, the example that I think of is gymnasts.
Yeah, sure.
If you want to have any chance of being a successful gymnast, I think you have to start when you're like practically old enough to walk, right? Like you have to be a very small child and make that discipline your entire life. Because, like, they're, how old are they when they go to the Olympics? They're in their early teens at the most, right?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
But, like,
I'm sure 13, 14, yeah.
Probably pre-puberty, I'm guessing, is because, like, then their bodies change and, or whatever. Right. But, like, so, yeah, to a degree, I think that there is that fanatical discipline that exists. But and he might just be, in a way, exaggerating it with the way that he did it. I don't think that there's, I guess academically there is stuff like that where parents might raise their kids with a very specific academic goal from a young age, but I don't know. Obviously, it's not this far.
And I think we're thinking in terms of what we're used to in the United States. Now, I don't know for a fact, but just think. Can you think to yourself, might there be some countries where this is more of a reality?
Yes, of course.
You know what I mean? And when you said gymnasts, I know, and if you ever watch being Romanian, if you ever watch like the Nadia Comaneci story, she lived in like a gymnast camp from the time she was a little girl. Like, she had family, but she didn't live with them. She lived with the gymnasts.
Right. Yeah.
So, how different is that from this book? Well, a little bit, but not so far out there as for this book to be considered unrealistic, I guess is my point.
And I think this is the point where I want to step into my, the things that this book made me think of, because I'm reading through this book, and one of the things that came to mind, now I've read some reviews about the book that, talk about feminism and gender equality and things like that. And they talk about like the whole idea of like Frankenstein's monster and things like that, like mad scientist type experiments. What this book got me thinking about was, I had a general thought, which was, this is what happens when someone who isn't a scientist believes that they're right about something scientific, which in a broader perspective is your flat earthers and your anti-vaxxers and stuff like that.
I can see that. I can see the flip side of it too, though. And again, not that I would suggest that anything that happened in this book was right, but through the eyes of the book, we were proven that their theories were proven to be true, at least up until the point where we jump on, right? These kids excelled at things well beyond somebody in the normal world, quote unquote, following the same path. At 12, they're basically like college level practitioners of certain things. There's a character mentioned, Kay, in the synopsis, who's a girl who does drawings like the ones you see on your social media, where you're like, what? That's not a photograph. That was just drawn with like one big pen. Like, that's who she is. But she's that at a super young age, because that's what she was crafted to be. But
the counterpoint of that is, like, if you did that with a group of kids that were mixed boys and girls, you probably would get the same result.
Yeah, I guess.
Like, the false equivalent, or whatever you want to call it, is like taking the girls out of the equation made the boys better. Taking the boys out of the equation made the girls better. But I mean, because they have nothing to like contrast it against. I mean, except for the real world. But the real world has produced people that are more prodigious than these kids.
Well, yes, and that's something that came up when I was reading the book too. Is that yes, there's always going to be, Mozart's always going to be whoever is the best composer of all time, right? And that one of these kids is probably not going to trump him. Where this experiment, the judging if it works or not is, did you produce someone equivalent or close to Mozart, where you have 26 kids that are all near the best at what they do. Do you follow what I'm saying?
I know that, but yeah. But again,
to put it in basketball terms, because we've talked a lot of basketball over the last few episodes, would they all be Michael Jordan level players, where 26 of 26 get to be that good versus 1 in a million or 10 million or whatever Michael Jordan is in his world? If you could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you produce 10 Michael Jordans out of 26 instead of 1 out of 200 million, then there's probably an argument that it worked.
Well, and then you'd have to base those. We're probably getting into the weeds here a little bit, but like, all you would have to do is compare those kids to students of mixed gender schools that have high achieving students that are focused on, like, similar academics, and see what is the difference. Is it significantly better? Is it not significantly better? And like, I'm thinking of, even in Chicago, Lane Tech, the high school, produces like something like 100% more, or like 10 times more like PhD, students than the, other, similar high schools in the Chicagoland area, something like that. So like, you can find those schools out there that, you know what I'm saying, are doing the same thing, absent the separation of gender and the insanity of of doing that.
Oh yeah, it's fucking crazy. Look, I'm playing devil's advocate here. I know. Also, maybe I should have gone to Lane Tech, because I could have, and I chose not to. You want to know why, Rob?
Why? You didn't want to take a bus there?
I lived across the street from a high school that I could go to versus, trucking. I don't want to say halfway across town, but, quarter way across town to get to Lane Tech.
You probably should have gone there. Anyway, that's the insanity of it, though. And like, that's what it made me think of, was your flat earthers or anti-vaxxers who get an idea in their head and just push for doing whatever they can to make that the result of their study. I don't know. Just a thought.
Are we ready to go on to spoiler talk?
I
I
think
feel
we
like
must.
there's nothing else I can say without spoiling anything. So for those of you, for the uninitiated, spoiler talk occurs over on our Patreon page at patreon.com/booked. Every now and then, which is about 75% of the time when we read a book, and we want to talk about things, that's where it happens. So usually those are 5 to 10, 15-minute episodes that have no setup or whatever. It's literally something you would listen to adjacent to this. So we're going to do that now. In the event that you're interested in that, it's $1 per month to get you that spoiler talk. Again, that's patreon.com/booked, and we'll be right back.
All right, we are back from spoiler talk. A lot of ground covered there. So here's what I'll say. Inspection is the type of book that you want to read sans spoilers to get the most out of it, because it's just great to have it revealed by the author, not some dick who read it. So please listen to the spoiler talk, but absolutely read the book first, and then, join in the conversation after that. Patreon.com/booked to check out that spoiler talk after you read the book.
Anything else you want to talk about before we wrap up?
One really quick thing. We got uncorrected advance proofs from the publisher, Del Rey. And when you get one of those, it says, don't quote from the book until you get the final copy, that kind of thing, because it's obviously not 100% done. And so I'm not going to, although I am going to.
It sounded like you were going that way.
There's one thing. So I was reading, and I'm not going to, I'll remove any spoiler information from it. But at one point, someone has a bunch of stuff in a backpack, and it's called a backpack. And I was like, oh, that's a typo. And then I read, over the course of a couple of chapters, the backpack is referred to multiple times, 3 or 4 times. Every time it's called a backpack. So I think that in this made up world, instead of a backpack, it's called a backpack.
I feel like I should flip through my book, because I don't remember seeing, and I could see missing it once. I can't see missing it a bunch of times.
It was 4. Yeah, it was at least 4 times.
And yeah, I mean, and I don't think we need to talk about this, but Malerman's a very solid writer. Story aside, it's all just written very well. There's, and this is something I'm sure we've mentioned before, but it's very readable, line by line, very readable and very well done. So not only does he have great storytelling ability, he's got the just kind of operational chops too.
And then there's one thing I can't not. I sent this as a screenshot to Livius, and it's later in the book, so I won't say what's going on. But the synopsis mentions a character named Kay, and there's a line in the book that says, "But Kay had no choice," and that just tickled me, because
don't say why. Let's do this. Hit us up on Twitter or Facebook if you have any idea what Rob's referencing. I did right away, but my comment back to him is, I wonder how many people would get what you're saying as a reference to something.
Yeah. So if you're out there and you understand why Kay had no choice is a cute, funny kind of thing to read, hit us up and let us know. That means Thomas Joyce is going to tell us.
Of course. Thomas Joyce always listens and always has feedback for us. Hey, Rob, I'm going to let you go first on this one.
It's no secret I've loved everything that we've read by Malerman, and everything I've read for the podcast. Loved Bird Box before it was cool. Unburied Carol was awesome. Black Mid Wheel was awesome. Everything so far has been great. So I went into this with a very favorable opinion of Josh's writing, and not really too worried that I would be disappointed. But I never expected to be so fucking impressed as I was with this book. And I messaged Livius, I think maybe 25% of the way of the book, and I really wish I knew what I had said, but essentially I was just so impressed by his writing in general. I found it. I said, so far I'm so impressed with Malerman's writing. It's just so, like Livius was just saying, from a technical perspective, so proficient. It's such an easy read, and it's just very, very engaging and engrossing, and such a unique idea. I'm sure that ideas like this have happened before, but he just crafted such a great story. And that's, I mean, at the end of the day, what I like about Malerman so much is that it's obvious when he writes a book that he's as curious about what's going to happen as we are. And it's that kind of wonder that he has for the story he's writing that really comes through in this. But also, just like Livius was saying, the dude's got chops. Like having a broad imagination and a rich kind of idea of a world that you could build is one thing, but being able to translate it from your brain onto a page is very difficult. And Malerman succeeded very well at this. So, I mean, based on what I've said, my rating's 5 stars.
I've also very much enjoyed everything I've read from Malerman. This one, the premise I thought was, it's a little science fiction-y. Science fiction's not really my thing. But, what the hell? I'm going to go into it open-minded and give it a shot. I said in spoiler talk, which you may hear if you head over there, this is the shortest 386-page book that I've ever read. And I say that because it just kept going. I wanted to know what happened. And there are books that I absolutely love, and there are a number of books that I've read 4 and 5 times. And each one of those books has at least one distinct spot in it where I'm like, all right, I'm at that part. I'm just going to have to get through this part so I can get back to being really into reading this, where it starts to drag a little bit. There is no such spot in Inspection. The story is, it has themes that have been explored before, I think, but not necessarily all in the same place. And I found it to be wholly original, but wholly original with things that felt and seemed familiar from other places. And that's not to shortchange the book. It's that it was grounded enough in reality and other things we've seen that nothing came off as too ridiculous. And in a book that, let's face it, on its premise, can be a little ridiculous. And the things that were ridiculous were written in the book. And Rob touched on this a little bit, right? Like at some point, like it doesn't seem like they had an exit plan. And you could see it going badly even when they couldn't. That was written into as part of the story. I had a feeling I knew how this book was going to end, and all I'll say is that Malerman not just met but exceeded my expectations for how this book was going to wrap up, and that's all I'll say there. It is written very proficiently, as I mentioned. Operationally, he's got everything he needs, and Rob probably put it a little better than I'm going to, but yeah. He had a great idea, and having a great idea and then translating that idea to the page so that somebody else appreciates your great idea is probably not the easiest thing in the world. And we've read books on this podcast. We've read books in our, off in our personal lives, right, in our non-podcast lives. We're like, man, this story had a lot of things going for it, but it didn't quite deliver. This is not the case in this book. Rob mentioned this on social media, and I will say it here. It's my favorite of Malerman's books, which is surprising because it didn't involve the supernatural. I guess some people would classify this as horror. I didn't and don't. But it's interesting to see him tackle very different books. And the reason I say that is when you talk great horror writers, Stephen King, all of his books, most of his books, not all of his books, but the majority of his books have a similar feel. Clive Barker, his books all have a similar feel. They all kind of take place in the same world. Josh's books don't. And it's interesting to see him continue to deliver great product from distinctly different books each time. So got to be honest, I'm really excited to see where he's going to go from here. Thoroughly enjoyed this book. My favorite Malerman book, which means it has to be 5 stars. So that's all I can give it.
2 things. The first thing, I wrote down our star ratings like 5 hours ago, having not known what we were going to give, and I was right. The second thing, I didn't say this before, but I'm going to because you kind of went there at the end of your review. He's very similar to Stephen Graham Jones in some ways, because Stephen Graham Jones transcends genre and stuff often, and he can write comfortably in so many different kind of worlds or styles, and still be like uniquely Jones. And I feel like Malerman has that kind of rare talent too. And so, I describe both of them very similarly. When I said that Malerman had kind of like a wonder about the story, and he was curious about how it was going to go. I always get that feeling from Stephen Graham Jones as well, is like someone who had an idea and writing the book is figuring out what it means. I feel like they both have that in common. And so when you said that, I was like, well, I got to mention it now.
Yeah. I always worry about those guys, though, because I worry that success in literature depends on a consistency in the type of story you tell.
Yeah.
And I think by and large, when you look at the New York Times bestselling authors, the guys who are on there all the time, they're all, like I said, like the Stephen Kings and the Clive Barkers or the Danielle Steeles and Mary Higgins Clarks, right? Like they all tell a very similar tale.
Right.
And I worry about guys like Stephen, and I worry about guys like Josh, because I think they're brilliant writers. And I don't think they should pigeonhole themselves from a personal standpoint, because it's exciting. And I meant what I say. I want to see what he does next, because I feel like it's not going to be like the previous 4 novels, I think it is, or 5, whatever it is. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But then I wonder, like, how many people pick this up expecting Bird Box and getting something totally different, and using or allowing that to cloud their judgment of what a great storyteller he is.
Sure. And I think that's consistent throughout history, because if you think about some people who are, known as an inventor, they also painted, but they're all only known as an inventor, like that kind of thing. And so I think that history kind of tends to pigeonhole people to the thing that we like the most about them, which is so unfair. And yeah, will happen in pop culture for sure.
And it's fucked up, because I used to only think of myself when reading books, right? Because A, it's a very solitary thing that you do, and B, most people don't get the opportunity that we have, which is to be able to talk to some people whose work we love. Like, yeah, maybe nowadays, but when I was 20, I couldn't just like fire off a Facebook post at Robert McCammon and let him know what I thought of his book, and then maybe just maybe get a response, right? But we're in a unique position where I could reach out to Malerman and ask a question, and other authors that we've had on over the years, or but now I worry about them. Like, I'm worried, Josh, that you know what I mean? I want you to be successful. And I never really cared about an author's success before, beyond I wanted them to have another book come out because I like their stuff.
Yeah. So
it's weird, because I start thinking about what can they do to get their stuff more widespread than before. I was just like, hey, I'm just happy there's a new, whatever, insert author here book on the shelf for me to read this week.
Yeah, I get that concern, but I also don't want them to change their style for that purpose. I don't know. I mean, like we've talked about Christopher Moore before, and he writes the funny book so he could get to the serious book. So I feel like he at least understands what his appeal is, and kind of leverages that to keep the machine going. And hopefully these guys find a way to do that as well, because yeah, they're fucking great.
Yeah. All right. We're going to try to get Josh on to talk about this book. I know it's coming out this week, so he's probably pretty busy, but we will try to have him on for you. Originally, I know Rob and I were thinking maybe at StokerCon, but he's a guest of honor at StokerCon. I think we should probably leave his time to the bigger, important duties that he has to do there. So we'll see if we can get him on for you guys here in the near future to talk about Inspection. And I really want to know what he's working on next. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. Like, I want to talk about Inspection, and it might be our first ever spoiler talk in an interview. Because I have some questions that need some answering, Josh. Just saying.
I love it. I can't remember what it was. It was a review of something. Whatever we reviewed last of it had to be Unburied Carol, right?
That would be the last thing from him. Yep.
He said something about how he listened to our review. I don't know if you saw this on like social media, but it was mentioned somewhere. And he said that him and Allison were like on a swing set in a park listening to it together, our review.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
I was like, you guys are just so fucking like. There's nothing about this guy that isn't just like charmingly, like, cute.
No kidding.
So good.
Hey, let's watch this transition. So, think we talked about this on the podcast about our plan, right? We had some books lined up that we were going to read.
Yeah,
Do you know, amongst like a ridiculous amount of very talented people that blurbed this book, I'm pulling out my little, I don't know if you sound
I can hear
effects.
that. Yeah.
That's that little letter that they include with the book, which is printed on black paper, which I know isn't the case, but it's all black.
Such
so
a
they
waste
print
of
the
toner.
black around the words. Yeah, it is a waste, totally. God damn it. I know. And that's, yeah. Well, they use book branding is what it is. White letters on a black background. But the first person in early praise for inspection is an author named Alma Katsu. And she is nominated for a Bram Stoker Award for Best Novel alongside Josh Malerman. So Rob and I talked a few weeks ago, and we are going to, because we're already 3 of 5 on having reviewed the Bram Stoker novel list, we're going to knock out the other 2. Next week, that will be The Hunger by Alma Katsu, who said very nice things about this book. She's up against Josh for a Stoker Award, so we know there's got to be at least a little bit of animosity there, right? Probably not from Josh. He seems like the nicest person in the world. I don't know this Alma lady at all, but I have to imagine one of them's got to be a little,
Yeah.
So to run down the list, we reviewed Unburied Carol by Josh Malerman, Dracul by Doc Ray Stoker and J.D. Barker, and, of course, The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay. So next on the list, Alma Katsu and The Hunger, and at some point, not necessarily the week after that, will be Jonathan Mayberry's Glimpse. So that's a little peek into the future for you. And this year, we will select our own Bram Stoker Award-winning author, because we will have, for the first time, read all of them. So
yeah, that'll be interesting to see how we align with an awards ceremony or whatever.
I mean, in looking at the list right now, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess I could pick from the 3. Can you pick? You don't have to answer this, but can you pick right now from the 3? Unburied Carol, Dracul, and The Cabin at the End of the World.
Yes.
Yep. So we'll see where these other 2, if that changes either one of our minds.
Yeah. All right, that's what's coming up for us boys. Got anything else? I think I'm ready to head out.
No, I think I'm good. Thank you for listening. Again, next week we'll have, I was going to say another horror book, but I'm not sure. I don't feel this inspection was horror. So we're going to have a horror book. Alma Katsu's The Hunger. Until then, I'm Livius Nedden.
And I'm Rob Olson. Keep reading.